Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic comes to us from commenter Bader, who requested a video about the elven hero Ecthelion. The great topic idea, let's get into it. Now, Ecthelion is perhaps the most underrated elven hero in Tolkien's mythology. Definitely belongs in the upper pantheon of elven heroes. With Glorfindel and Fingolfin and Gil-galad. If you were to name 10 elven heroes, he's got to be in that list of top 10. And yet, not a whole lot of people know about him. Mainly because he comes in a kind of a narrow section of the mythology. Specifically, we hear about him in The Fall of Gondolin. Which is interesting because that is one of the first works that Tolkien wrote. Way back in 1917, during World War I, he was working on the first version of The Fall of Gondolin. And so that means that Ecthelion is one of the first characters he ever wrote down in detail. Now, the name Ecthelion might sound familiar. That's because in The Lord of the Rings, it is the official name of the White Tower of Minas Tirith. There's that line from the Fellowship of the Ring when Boromir says to Aragorn, "Have you ever seen it, Aragorn? The White Tower of Ecthelion, glimmering like a spike of pearl and silver." That's what he's talking about, this Tower of Ecthelion. Now, the Tower of Ecthelion is named for Ecthelion I, who was a steward of Gondor. But that guy is named for our hero that we're talking about today, Ecthelion of the Fountain. So Ecthelion I was a human, Ecthelion of the Fountain, an elf. Little is known about Ecthelion's background. We don't know his parentage, for instance. And the window of time that we hear about him is pretty small. We first hear about him in the year 316 of the First Age, and he dies heroically at the Fall of Gondolin in 510. So we basically have a 200-year window where we hear about the exploits of Ecthelion. In some of his earliest writings, Tolkien describes Ecthelion as the fairest of the Noldor. And we also know that he has the title of the Warden of the Great Gate of Gondolin. Gondolin is a city ruled by King Turgon of the Elves. So from those aspects, I think we can make a few assumptions. Ecthelion is a Noldor elf, and likely he followed Turgon when the Noldor elves were exiled from Aman, which also means that Ecthelion was likely born in the years of the trees, before the First Age. I've talked about the exile of the elves in some other videos, but it's pretty relevant to this story, so let me just sum up briefly why the Noldor elves were exiled. We're back before the First Age, and Feanor decides he's gonna head to Middle-earth to take back the Silmaril gems that were stolen by Morgoth. And he makes this big oath, and the Noldor elves decide they're going to follow Feanor against the will of the Valar. The Valar are like, "Don't you go," and the elves are like, "We're going." Along the way, they need boats. There are some elves that have boats, don't want to give Feanor the boats. Feanor kills them for the boats. And that's a huge no-no, obviously, the kinslaying. And so what ends up happening is this thing called the Doom of Mandos. Either Mandos or one of his representatives appears before the Noldor, who are on their way, and makes this doom, a prophecy, essentially, that says, look, Feanor, you have killed your kin. That's essentially a sin. And you're going to, reap what you sow. But note this, anyone who follows Feanor will also suffer this terrible consequence. So for all of those who are following Feanor to Middle-earth, just that things are not going to work out for you. Well, that doesn't discourage most of the Noldor. Some of them turn back at that point, but a lot of the Noldor elves are like, we're at full speed ahead. Well, one of those is Fingolfin, Feanor's half-brother. Fingolfin has 4 kids. There's Fingon, there's Turgon, very important to this story we're telling, Earendil, very important to the story that we're telling, and Argon, not really important to the story we're telling. But all of those folks, So Fingolfin and all of his 4 kids die violent deaths. And it's due mostly to this idea of the doom of Mendos. It weighs heavily on the Noldor that went to Middle-earth following Feanor. And Ecthelion is caught up in that. He, as a follower, as a noted follower of Turgon, his fate is tied up with Turgon's. So whereas Fingolfin, Turgon's dad, was like, attack! Turgon tried to take a different approach to surviving in Middle-earth, and that was, I'm going to create a hidden city. Something that Morgoth can't find us. And so, he builds Gondolin. Gondolin is completed in the year 116 of the First Age. And the social and political power of Gondolin is divided into 12 houses. I'm not going to go into all 12 houses here, but here are a few to keep in mind. There's the House of the King, that is led by King Turgon, obviously. There's the House of the Golden Flower, which is led by Glorfindel. Done a video on him. Amazing elven hero. There's the House of the Wing, which is led by the human hero Tuor. Very important to this story. Just note that. There's the House of the Mole, led by Maeglin. Also important to the story in that he's the one that betrays Gondolin. And I know if you're going to have to be a member of a house, the House of the Mole. You're like, oh, great. Okay. Couldn't be the House of the Golden Flower? Oh, fine. The Mole House. Great. And finally, there's the House of the Fountain. And the leader of the House of the Fountain is Ecthelion. He is known as Ecthelion of the Fountain. Hence the reason he's known as Ecthelion of the Fountain. I think that the fountain that is referenced in the House of the Fountain is the fountain that is in the Square of the King. It's right in the middle of Gondolin, right next to the King's Tower. And it's said to shoot water 150 feet in the air. It's this amazing fountain. It's very deep as well. And this is where Ecthelion and King Turgon make their final stand during the fall of Gondolin. And I think what it references is perhaps that the House of the Fountain serve as the honor guard for the king. Their place in the city is the King's Square. They guard the Tower of the King. So I think that's why they're called the House of the Fountain. Ecthelion is described as a uniquely talented musician, specializing in the flute. And the followers of the House of the Fountain actually march into battle all playing flutes. And their garb is adorned with silver and diamonds. So they make quite the fashion statement. I mentioned that we first hear about Ecthelion in the year 316 of the First Age. That's about 200 years after Gondolin has been completed as a city. King Turgon's sister, Earendil, is yearning to get outside the city. She wants to revisit the outside world. Turgon is worried for her safety and also for the secrecy of this theoretically hidden city, but he eventually relents on 2 conditions. One, that she go directly to visit his brother Fingon. She doesn't. And 2, that she be accompanied by 3 guardians. Needless to say, she has some misadventures. This is not an uneventful trip to her brother Fingon's house. I'm going to read you a passage from the Silmarillion about this event, and you'll note that the 3 guardians aren't named, but in later writings, Tolkien confirmed that the 3 guardians sent with Earendil were Glorfindel, Ecthelion, and a character named Egelmoth. I won't talk about him so much except to say that he was the lord of another one of those 12 houses, the House of the Heavenly Arch. So these are 3 lords of Gondolin sent off to protect Earendil. All does not go well. And Turgon appointed 3 lords of his household to ride with Earendil, and he bade them lead her to Fingon in Hithlum, if they might prevail upon her. And be wary, he said, for though Morgoth be yet hemmed in the north, there are many perils in Middle-earth of which the lady knows nothing. Then Earendil departed from Gondolin, and Turgon's heart was heavy at her going. As they drew near to the evil region of Nan Dungortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death, the riders became enmeshed in shadows, and Earendil strayed from her companions and was lost. They sought long for her in vain, fearing that she had been ensnared or had drunk from the poisoned streams of that land. But the fell creatures of Ungoliant that dwelt in the ravines were aroused and pursued them, and they hardly escaped with their lives. When at last they returned and their tale was told, there was great sorrow in Gondolin, and Turgon sat long alone, enduring grief and anger in silence. So, not an auspicious beginning for Ecthelion. He loses the king's sister. But, not really his fault, right? We got Glorfindel, Ecthelion, this guy Egomoth. They end up straying too close to Ungoliant's realm. Now, Ungoliant, I've done a video about her. Giant spider, destroyed the trees of the Valar. Seems like they get caught up in her webs of darkness, and her children, these giant spiders, start attacking. So Glorfindel, Ecthelion, Egomoth manage to survive. That's about all they can do. Meanwhile, Earendil is separated from them, and they have to return to King Turgon and say, oops, we lost her, and they kind of presume that she's dead. She's not dead. Instead of dying, Earendil is found by Eöl, the Dark Elf. I've done a video about Eöl if you're interested in that. They get married. They have a child, Maeglin. 80 years or so after she left, she returns to Gondolin with Maeglin, her son, followed by Eöl. Eöl accidentally kills Earendil while attempting to kill Maeglin, is then executed for that murder. And so Earendil and Eöl are both dead. Maeglin becomes a trusted member of the court, since he is a nephew of King Turgon at this point. And of course he becomes the leader of the House of the Mole. Narratively, Earendil's misguided journey and our greatest elven hero's failure to protect her is a piece of this doom of Mandos. Because without all those events happening, there is no Maeglin. Maeglin wouldn't be born if Earendil hadn't managed to get away from her guardians. And it's Maeglin that betrays Gondolin in the end, results in the fall of Gondolin. So all these events kind of transpire so that Maeglin can be born and then come to Gondolin and betray it. So we had the failure of Ecthelion to protect Earendil back in 316 of the First Age. Now we flash forward to 472 of the First Age. This is the date of the infamous Battle of Unnumbered Tears. This results in the death of a bunch of heroes. Here's a description of the battle from the Silmarillion. And note, there's a conversation between Turgon and the human hero Huor, in which Turgon admits that Gondolin is doomed. And this is about 100 years before it actually does fall. So it's just interesting that deep inside, he knows he's living on borrowed time. But now in the western battle, Fingon and Turgon were assailed by a tide of foes thrice greater than all the force that was left to them. Gothmog, lord of the Balrogs, high captain of Angband, was come, and he drove a dark wedge between the elven hosts. Then he turned upon Fingon. That was a grim meeting. At last, Fingon stood alone with his guard dead about him, and he fought with Gothmog until another Balrog came behind and cast a thong of fire about him. Then Gothmog hewed him with his black axe, and a white flame sprang up from the helm of Fingon as it was cloven. Thus fell the High King of the Noldor, and they beat him into the dust with their maces, and his banner, blue and silver, they trod into the mire of his blood. The field was lost, but still Hurin and Huor and the remnant of the House of Haldor stood firm with Turgon of Gondolin, and the hosts of Morgoth could not yet win the pass of Sirion. Then Hurin spoke to Turgon, saying, "Go now, Lord, for in you lives the last hope of the Eldar, and while Gondolin stands, Morgoth shall still know fear in his heart." But Turgon answered, "Not long now can Gondolin be hidden, and being discovered, it must fall." And Huor spoke and said, Yet if it stands but a little while, then out of your house shall come the hope of elves and men. This I say to you, Lord, with the eyes of death. Though we part here forever, and I shall not look on your white walls again, from you and from me a new star shall arise. Farewell. And Maeglin, Turgon's sister son, who stood by, heard these words and did not forget them, but he said nothing. Then Turgon took the counsel of Hurin and Huor, and summoning all that remained of the host of Gondolin, he retreated towards the pass of Sirion, and his captains, Ecthelion and Glorfindel, guarded the flanks to right and left, so that none of the enemy should pass by them. But the men of Dorlomin held the rear guard, as Hurin and Huor desired, for they did not wish in their hearts to leave the Northlands, and if they could not win back to their homes, there they would stand to the end. So, pretty grim stuff. That description of Fingon being mutilated by Gothmog is pretty gruesome stuff. Gothmog, Lord of the Balrogs, not only killed Fingon, also killed Feanor years earlier. And he's the one that Ecthelion is going to square off against. So Fingon is killed. The House of Haldor, representing men, is crushed in this battle. Hurin is captured, tortured, and cursed with a terrible curse by Morgoth. Huor is killed, but in the same year, Huor's wife, Rianne, gives birth to their son, Tuor. Tuor, very important to Gondolin, very important to the story of Ecthelion. So this is when Tuor is born, the year of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Rianne, his mother, puts Tuor into like an elven foster care while she goes looking for Huor. She eventually comes to the battle site, sees the mound of bodies, and she dies from grief. And so it leaves little infant Tuor as an orphan. Flash forward 24 years. Tuor is now an adult, and he is visited by one of the Valar, Ulmo, Lord of the Waters. It's not every day that a human gets visited by a member of the Valar. Big deal. Ulmo has a warning that he wants Tuor to give to Gondolin, basically saying the doom of Mandos is near at hand, and the residents of Gondolin should leave. Easier said than done. Gondolin is a hidden city, after all. Ulmo gives Tuor a cloak and tells him to go. Eventually, Tuor does show up at the gates of Gondolin, accompanied by two elves, Elimakil and Varanve. I don't want to get too into the weeds with tons of character names, but I mention them because you're going to hear them in the quote that I'm about to read. Here's where Tuor meets Ecthelion, because Ecthelion is warden of the gates. This is from the Unfinished Tales. Straightway there issued riders from the towers, but before those of the North Tower came one upon a white horse, and he dismounted and strode towards them. And high and noble as was Elimakil, greater and more lordly was Ecthelion, Lord of the Fountains, at that time warden of the great gate. All in silver was he clad, and upon his shining helm there was set a spike of steel pointed with a diamond. And as his esquire took his shield, it shimmered as if it were bedewed with drops of rain that were indeed 1,000 studs of crystal. Elimakil saluted him and said, Here have I brought Varanve, and here is the stranger that he has led hither, who demands to see the king. Then Ecthelion turned to Tuor, but he drew his cloak about him and stood silent, facing him. And it seemed to Varanve that a mist mantled Tuor, and his stature was increased, so that the peak of his high hood overtopped the helm of the elf lord, as it were the crest of a great sea wave riding to the land. But Ecthelion bent his bright glance upon Tuor, and after a silence he spoke gravely, saying, You have come to the last gate. Know then that no stranger who passes it shall ever go out again, save by the door of death. Speak not ill-boding. If the messenger of the Lord of Waters go by that door, then all those who dwell here will follow him. Lord of the Fountains, hinder not the messenger of the Lord of Waters." For a while Ecthelion stood silent, looking at Tuor, and slowly awe filled his face, as if in the gray shadow of Tuor's cloak he saw visions from far away. Then he bowed and went to the fence and laid hands upon it, and gates opened inward on either side of the pillar of the crown. Then Tuor passed through, and coming to a high sward that looked out over the valley beyond, he beheld a vision of Gondolin amid the white snow. And so entranced was he that for long he could look at nothing else, for he saw before him at last the vision of his desire out of dreams of longing. Then Ecthelion said at last, "Now no further proof is needed, and even the name he claims as son of Huor matters less than this clear truth, that he comes from Ulmo himself." I like that we get actual dialogue between Ecthelion and Tuor here. We get to hear Ecthelion's voice. And note also the description of Ecthelion's helmet. He's got a spike of steel tipped with a diamond. That's going to come in handy later. And it's the cloak that saves Tuor in this moment, right? Ecthelion realizes, oh, that cloak is from Ulmo. This person is an emissary sent from Ulmo. So Tuor is taken to King Turgon, gives the warning of Ulmo about the doom of Mandos. Turgon doesn't listen to it. For whatever reason, at this moment, 100 years earlier, he was ready to say, oh yeah, we're going to get found out and we would certainly fall. But at this point, he's like, things are okay. I'm willing to play this out. But I am going to close up the hidden door and no one can now leave the city. So Tuor becomes stuck in Gondolin. Over time, he becomes enamored of Tuor's daughter, Idril. They fall in love, and they have a child, a very special child, Earendil. Earendil is incredibly important to Tolkien's mythology. I've done a video about him as well. But meanwhile, Maeglin, who's been here all this time, kind of at the right hand of the king, is jealous of Tuor. He's been displaced as the king's favorite. Turgon really likes Tuor. And also, Maeglin has feelings for Idril. They're unrequited, but still, he is jealous of Tuor that Tuor got to marry Idril. Eventually, Maeglin defies Turgon's orders. He goes wandering outside of the city. He gets captured. Morgoth makes a deal with him to say, hey, if you show me the location of the Gondolin, I'll make you not only leader of Gondolin, but I'll also give you Idril. And so Maeglin agrees, and thus the betrayal of Gondolin is set. At last, in the year when Earendil was 7 years old, Morgoth was ready, and he loosed upon Gondolin his Balrogs and his orcs and his wolves, and with them came dragons of the brood of Glaurung, and they were become now many and terrible. The host of Morgoth came over the northern hills where the height was greatest, and the watch least vigilant. And it came at night, upon a time of festival, when all the people of Gondolin were upon the walls to await the rising sun, and sing their songs at its uplifting. For the morrow was the great feast that they named the Gates of Summer. But the red light mounted the hills in the north, and not in the east. And there was no stay in the advance of the foe until they were beneath the very walls of Gondolin, and the city was beleaguered without hope. Of the deeds of desperate valor there done, by the chieftains of the noble houses and their warriors, and not least by Tuor, much is told in the fall of Gondolin. Of the battle of Ecthelion of the Fountain, with Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, in the very square of the king, where each slew the other, and of the defense of the tower of Turgon by the people of his household, until the tower was overthrown. And mighty was its fall, and the fall of Turgon in its ruin. So we are told of this tragic battle, a hopeless fight, essentially, to hold off the forces of Morgoth, in which several of our heroes get killed off. And luckily for us, there's actually a more vivid account of this battle in The Fall of Gondolin. I mentioned Tolkien originally was writing The Fall of Gondolin back in 1917. Well, that original work got published. And so we get this account. And I'll just note this. You can tell that he's in the middle of a world war when he's writing these words, because the description of the battle, the prose, is some pretty grim stuff. Here we go. Now therefore Melkor's goblins held all the gate, and a great part of the walls on either side. Yet about those ways and around the gate their dead were piled in uncounted heaps, and they halted therefore and took counsel, seeing that for the valor of the Gondolin they had lost many more than they had hoped, and far more than those defenders. But even as their messengers were sped, they heard a sweet music that was played amidst the host of the Gondolin, and they feared what it might mean. And lo, there came Ecthelion, and the people of the fountain, whom Turgon till now had held in reserve, for he watched the most of that affray from the heights of his tower. Now marched these folk to a great playing of their flutes, and the crystal and silver of their array was most lovely to see, amid the red light of the fires and the blackness of the ruins. Then on a sudden their music ceased, and Ecthelion of the fair voice shouted for the drawing of swords, and before the orcs might foresee his onslaught, the flashing of those pale blades was amongst them. It is said that Ecthelion's folk there slew more of the goblins than fell ever in all the battles with that race, and that his name is a terror among them to this latest day, and a war cry to the Eldar. So that's cool news, right? I mean, this is like his name, Ecthelion, is a war cry for the elves. And they slew more goblins than had ever fallen in any battle in this moment. And also that the imagery of the flutes just suddenly cutting off, and then the swords get drawn. That's a really evocative image. So we pick it back up here. Dragons show up. One of those brazen snakes heaves against the western wall, and a great mass of it shakes and falls, and behind comes a creature of fire, and Balrogs upon it. Flames gust from the jaws of that worm, and folk wither before it. And the wings of the helm of Tuor are blackened, but he stands and gathers about him his guard, and all of the arch and swallow he can find, whereas on his right Ecthelion rallies the men of the Fountain of the South. So there you've got this thing where it's like, like an armored troop transport. This fire-breathing drake, I don't think they're winged at that point, shows up with Balrogs riding it. So that can't be good. Now the orcs again take heart from the coming of the drakes, and they mingle with the Balrogs that pour about the breach, and they assail the Gondolin grievously. There Tuor slew Othrod, a lord of the orcs, cleaving his helm, and Baukmeg he hewed asunder, and Lug he smote with his axe that his limbs were cut from beneath him at the knee. But Ecthelion shore through 2 captains of the goblins at a sweep, and cleft the head of Orcobal, their chiefest champion, to his teeth. And by reason of the great doughtiness of these 2 lords, they came even unto the Balrogs. Of those demons of power, Ecthelion slew 3, for the brightness of his sword cleft the iron of them, and did hurt to their fire, and they writhed. But so it is that few cannot fight always against the many. And Ecthelion's left arm got a sore rent from a whip of the Balrogs, and his shield fell to earth, even as that dragon of fire drew nigh amid the ruin of the walls. Then Ecthelion must lean on Tuor, and Tuor might not leave him, though the very feet of the trampling beast were upon them, and they were like to be overborne. But Tuor hewed at a foot of the creature, so that flames spouted forth, and that serpent screamed, lashing with its tail. Now Tuor gathered his might, and lifted Ecthelion, and amid a remnant of the folk got thereunder, and escaped the drake. Thus it was that, fighting as he yielded ground, he bore from that battle Ecthelion of the Fountain. So it's just chaos and mayhem. Tuor and Ecthelion are taking out the orc captains. Ecthelion takes out 3 Balrogs, but in the process loses his shield and injures his shield arm. Dragon shows up. Looks like it's the end for Ecthelion. Tuor manages to dodge the dragon's feet and fire and lifts Ecthelion, drags him away from the field in that moment, and basically takes him back into the Square of the King next to the fountain. There Tuor became weary from the strangling heat and was beaten down by a great demon, Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs. But lo, Ecthelion, whose face was of the pallor of grey steel and whose shield arm hung limp at his side, strode above him as he fell, and that gnome drove at the demon, yet did not give him his death, getting rather a wound to his sword arm, that his weapon left his grasp. Then leapt Ecthelion, Lord of the Fountain, fairest of the Noldor, full at Gothmog, even as he raised his whip, and his helm, that had a spike upon it, he drove into that evil breast, and he twined his legs about his foeman's thighs, and the Balrog yelled and fell forward. But those 2 dropped into the basin of the king's fountain, which was very deep. There found that creature his bane, and Ecthelion sank steel-laden into the depths, and so perished the Lord of the Fountain after fiery battle in cool waters. And so Ecthelion of the Fountain drowned in the fountain in King's Square. His armor dragged him down even as he was killing Gothmog. All he's got left is his helmet, and he takes out Gothmog, Lord of the Balrogs. Very heroic stuff. In so doing, he saves Tuor's life. Tuor had just saved him from the dragon, and in that moment, Tuor is losing to Gothmog. It's the great quote there where it says that Ecthelion leaps over the falling Tuor to stand in front of him to defend Tuor and the city against Gothmog. So saving Tuor is critically important. Tuor then goes on to save his wife and 7-year-old child, Earendil, from Maeglin. Maeglin is about to kill the little kid when Tuor shows up, throws Maeglin off the city walls, and Idril, Tuor, and Earendil and a group leave by a hidden path and manage to escape the city. During their escape, they are attacked on the mountain passes by orcs and another Balrog, and it's Glorfindel who sacrifices himself in that moment to kill that Balrog. We learn later that Glorfindel is brought back, but his physical body is destroyed as he falls with a Balrog as well, much like Ecthelion fell into the fountain. And so the actions of all of Gondolin, but particularly these heroes, Glorfindel, Ecthelion, Tuor, keep our young Earendil alive. And that becomes the legacy of Gondolin. Gondolin survived just long enough to produce this half-elf, Earendil, and its heroes died to protect him from Morgoth. And about 30 years after the fall of Gondolin, a fully grown Earendil and his wife, Elwing, would journey to Valinor, end the doom of Mandos, and save the elves and men of Middle-earth. They would also have twin sons, Elros and Elrond, who you might have heard of. And so that is why this doom of Mandos is so relevant to this story. The actions of the defenders of Gondolin, notably Ecthelion, helped to indirectly end the doom of Mandos. Kept Earendil alive. He ended this doom. And elves and humans were saved at the end of the First Age when the Valar sent an army and Morgoth was defeated in the War of Wrath. None of that happens if Earendil gets killed off before he can escape the city. And so I'll end fittingly with a quote from Earendil about Ecthelion. This quote comes a few hours after the fall of Gondolin, when those who have escaped are relatively safe. And this is a little 7-year-old Earendil asking about Ecthelion. Now came they to the foothills, And many slept despite their peril, for they were utterly spent. Yet Tuor set a strict watch, and himself slept not. Here they made one meal of scanty food and broken meats, and the Earendil quenched his thirst and played beside a little brook. Then he said to his mother, "Mother Idril, I would we had good Ecthelion of the fountain here to play to me on his flute, or make me willow whistles. Perchance, has he gone on ahead?" But Idril said nay, and told what she had heard of his end. Then said Earendil that he cared not ever to see the streets of Gondolin again, and he wept bitterly. But Tuor said that he would not again see those streets, for Gondolin is no more. And there ends the story of Ecthelion and the story of Gondolin. So, Bader, I hope that answers your question. If you out there have a topic you'd like me to do a video about, feel free to put it in the comments. Be happy to do a video about a topic of your choosing. Thanks so much, everybody, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.